Hello there, and welcome to our webinar, The 5 Stages of Personalization Maturity. Well, if you're here with us today, then you're already very aware of the importance of personalization to your business. But knowing that and achieving it are not the same thing. So where are you in your personalization journey? Are you just scratching the surface of what's possible? And is scratching the surface actually good enough? Richard Isaac, CEO of Real Decoy Consulting, is here with me today to walk us through the Personalization Maturity Model. First, some housekeeping. The lines are muted, but we do want your questions. Use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen to send us your questions at any time. Now I'm delighted to introduce you to Richard Isaac, digital commerce guru and CEO of Real Decoy Consulting, a valued partner of LucidWorks. Hey, Richard, how are you?
I'm doing great. Hi, Diane. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. You and your company have been working in the digital marketing and digital commerce space for like 2 decades, which is not much later than when the web began, right? You've seen the evolution as you've helped B2C brands like American Greetings, Coach, Land's End, Samsung, Office Depot, and B2B organizations like Honeywell, Cisco Foods, Acklands Granger, numerous banks use technology to find new ways to delight customers so they spend a little more time on your site and spend a little more money driving up conversions and really overall customer loyalty. How have customer expectations changed over the years?
That's a great question, Diane. So yeah, I've been in the industry for a long time and worked with a lot of organizations as they've been going through these changes. And what we find is the organizations that are doing the best are the ones that are able to listen closely to their customers and take action as they learn how the customer's expectations are changing. So customers' expectations are changing at a rapid rate. They are accelerating primarily because the channels by which they interact with brands has really shifted. You know, it's moved from being in store to being online via desktop to being on mobile now and really through multiple channels. So and then when you look at B2B companies, the buyers are typically getting younger, right? You have more millennials who are more comfortable with technology. So the expectations are changing rapidly, and it's really important that we're able to listen to the customers and adapt quickly.
This is a piece of research you sent over earlier. Is this real? I mean, this is 6 months away. It is accurate. 51% of consumers expect that companies will anticipate their needs and make relevant suggestions, which is surprising, right? A lot of people or a lot of companies are a little concerned about, creeping out the audience by being too proactive in terms of personalization. But it really seems like customers do have this expectation, and more than half of the customers have the expectation of having their needs anticipated in advance. And the good news is it's very possible. Is there agreement, though, as to what that means when they say they want you to understand their intent before they get there? Is there agreement to that?
Yeah. Well, what's fascinating, and I've read a lot of content around this area. It's an area that I spend a lot of time in. What I find very fascinating is that generally speaking, consumers are happy to share information about themselves, and for that information that they've shared to be used to drive personalization. Where things start to go sideways or where consumers start to feel negative is when information they haven't shared about themselves is used to drive personalization, right? So using information that you find maybe on Facebook to drive personalization within a website experience, they will usually have a negative reaction.
Oh, that's interesting. So you said that it's possible, but in your mind, how are companies faring as they prepare for this great personalization?
To be honest, most of the companies that we work with and that I've seen are not doing a great job at personalization. And the reason we put together the Personalization Maturity Model, which really isn't that complex of a model, but it's to sort of explain the various stages that a company can go through when they're trying to drive more advanced personalization. It's not an all or nothing game. And it really is about understanding the intent of your audience and understanding the ROI of the investment that needs to be made in order to drive personalization. Like, there are businesses where investing in driving personalization may not make financial sense, right? So it's important to look at the bigger picture and to understand what is the intent of our customers, what is the maturity level of our customers, and what level of personalization is going to drive the biggest return on our investment.
So give me an example what you mean by that not everybody's going to need to do all these things.
Yeah, I mean, depending on the industry that you're in, depending on the type of customers that you're catering to, there are different levels of personalization that might be needed. And we'll get a little deeper into that, Diane, in a few slides. But as an example, providing personalization through knowing the geographic location of somebody may be valuable in certain industries, but may be irrelevant in others, right? So that's what I mean by it really does depend on the type of business that you're running and understanding the intent of the customer or the audience that's interacting with you.
Richard, on this slide, you've emphasized large and consistent scale. What do you mean by that, and what do you mean by across all channels?
There are two things that come to mind when you ask that question, Diane. The first one is a lot of personalization that we see happening today is based on, what I consider to be a rudimentary approach of using business rules and personas to custom build triggers, let's say, to drive personalization based on someone's behavior on a website. So we find that it's very difficult to do that manually and be able to reach a large scale, right? It's not a very scalable process. I work with a customer that currently manages 6,000 rules manually to drive personalization to their consumers or to their website visitors, right? That's a very difficult way to scale. But from a consistency standpoint, the second thing I think about is how consistent is the personalization you're driving across all of your channels. So what we find is that consumers tend to have a very negative reaction when personalization is driven very well, let's say through a digital channel like a website, but then is non-existent when they have an in-store interaction or when they deal with a teller at a bank or when they call a customer service rep. Consumers want a consistent interaction. And so anything that you're using, any technology, any methodologies that you're using to drive personalization really should be leveraged across all of the channels.
So is it better to increment and bring everything up equally across all channels so you get that consistency? Or should can you sacrifice one in exchange for the other for a little bit and then bring it up? Or how do you normally see it? And if I'm jumping the gun a little bit, we can get to that later.
No, it's an excellent question. So if somebody showed up and said, "Hey, I have money to spend on driving personalization, how advanced should I go through my digital channels?" I would say it would be better to think it out and make incremental improvements across all of your channels so that there's consistency than having very advanced personalization across one channel and being far behind across all of your other channels. So consistency across interactions is extremely important in the overall sentiment that a consumer will have dealing with your brand.
So I'm certain a lot of people listening right now are sort of going, "Oh my Lord, that's what I was afraid of," because it's one thing your department might be really thinking avant-garde, I've got to get there, this is what I have to do, and another department or division that controls another channel might not have the same feelings. How do these cohorts work together? How does the innovative cohort, like the ones listening today, they're here, getting more information, probably trying to figure out how to move the whole organization forward, and you're saying, or they were trying to move the ball forward, and you're saying, no, you got to move the whole team forward. How do they do that? What do you suggest?
Yeah, and it's a question I get all of the time. And when people say, what is the hardest part of innovation? It's not the technology, and it's not the vision of making the changes. It's really to get buy-in within across the organization. And some organizations understand the need to do this, and so buy-in is quite simple. But in other cases, organizations feel like what they're doing is good enough. But I think if you look at all of the disruption that's taking place across all of the verticals in the industries, that I can think of, I would be surprised if an organization feels like what they're doing is good enough. I think most organizations realize that they do need to invest in these changes, and so getting buy-in is important. But I would absolutely encourage anyone that wants to make these sorts of changes to invest the appropriate amount of time getting buy-in from the executive team or from the various departments that these types of changes would impact.
So let's talk about the maturity model. You came up with this. What was the purpose behind it?
Yeah, I mean, we came up with the maturity model just to simplify the conversation around what does personalization mean, and how do I know if I'm doing, where I am in my maturity around personalization and what the logical next step looks like, right? And it really is meant to provide a simple benchmark so that you can say, like, here's where we are, and here's where we could possibly go. And to open up the conversations around, well, is it worth the investment to go to the next level? Are we measuring the things that are important, so that we know if the changes we're making are driving better conversion rates? I mean, ultimately, all of this comes down to improving the conversion rates across all of your channels. And I just wanted to talk about an analogy that I often use whenever before I start talking about the maturity model, and the analogy is really around wine. So when I talk about making investments and improving your level of personalization within the organization, and I say pay close attention to the return on investment, right? It's not a linear amount of money that you need to spend to move through the pyramid. So over the next 5 slides, we'll talk about all of those levels, but it's not a linear slide. The further up the pyramid you go, the more exponential the investment becomes. So the analogy that I use relating to wine is, buying it is like buying a $20 bottle of wine versus a $100 bottle of wine versus a $1,000 bottle of wine. The value or the return that you get in terms of noticeable improvement starts to diminish while the investment starts to increase the more you go up that chain, right? So it's not just about throwing more money at the problem. It's about understanding where the perfect intersection is of value to investment for your organization when it comes to personalization.
Okay, great. Let's go through your pyramid.
Fantastic. Okay, so the first level of the pyramid is the easiest, right? And surprisingly enough, it's probably where most organizations are today. Greeting someone with their name when they visit your website is not considered personalization as far as I'm concerned, right? So what I mean by no personalization is that every visitor of your website or every visitor across any of your channels really is getting the exact same experience, right? So there's no differentiation in terms of the experience that you provide to various consumers, right? But then what happens is organizations start to talk and they say, you know what, we want to start providing more relevant content. It's all about relevancy, right? We want to provide more relevant content to website visitors, And so usually where organizations start is they say, you know what, we're going to do something called localization, right? It's a form of personalization where you're looking at the geographic location of somebody and saying, you know, we want to provide relevant information for those visitors based on their geography, whether that's customizing the language that they have at a very simple level, or whether it's something a little bit more sophisticated. For example, I know that some retailers that we've worked with that started doing localization, if you do a search for jacket, or you're browsing jackets, or you have a sale on jackets, and you're visiting from New York City, it's going to give you a very different search relevancy or a different experience on the homepage or landing pages than if you're searching for jackets out of, you know, Seattle or out of Florida, right? So depending on the location of the audience, we can sort of predict certain things around whether and how they might be, how we might be able to provide more relevancy based on the location that they are in, right?
Right.
And feel free to interject at any point, Diane. So once organizations start doing that, the sort of next iteration tends to be, okay, we know where they are visiting from, but maybe we should start creating segmentation of our various customers, right? B2B companies usually love to start here because they have rich information around the type of audiences or the type of customers that interact with them. But this applies equally as well to B2C companies. So when I talk about persona, what we're saying is we're creating categories of visitors. We're saying, you know, this is a male or a female within this age group maybe, or that likes to buy this sort of product. And the level of segmentation can get fairly sophisticated. And this is where a lot of companies can sometimes run into problems around unscalable approach to rule development because they create so many different personas. But then
I was just going to say this must create an untold amount of rules. I mean, I've worked for numerous B2B companies and trying to remember all these journeys for all the different personas. And then it's fine to actually get it started, but that it's maintaining it. You know, you've got old assets, you need to pull it out, you need to replace it. How do you remember to do all that? I mean, it's mind-boggling.
It is, and that's why I say it usually starts with segmentation, and segmentation is then used to drive the next level of the pyramid, which is, you know, what I call personalization. But really, a lot of companies start to stumble between these two stages because they realize that the approach that they're using doesn't scale, and if it doesn't scale on one medium, like in one channel, it won't scale across any of your channels. So it starts with the right intent to say, you know what, I think we can segment our audience. You know, if I use a B2B company as an example, if I segment my audience, I can probably segment them into, you know, 30 buckets. Yeah, you know, I can probably create enough rules to drive personalization for those 30 segments manually. But as it becomes more sophisticated and as you want to drive deeper personalization, the manual approach becomes unscalable. So what organizations then start to do, again, and I've seen organizations managing tens of thousands of rules manually, where they've got entire teams managing these rules, and they start looking at additional information to enrich the personalization. So, you know, I talked about social media. I'm not a big fan of leveraging social media to drive personalization because the negative impact sometimes outweighs the positive impact. But things like, you know, purchase history, product viewing history, there's a lot of different things that you can start to track, or I should say all companies I talk to track this information. But this data can now be used to help drive additional or more sophisticated personalization. But again, this is not at the peak of the pyramid. We're still talking about driving personalization at a segment level. It's not at an individual level still. It's still at a segment level.
So you're talking, this is like if in B2B too, account-based marketing, that's a lot of this area, right? Where you know the account and you're trying to present the information. It's still fairly generic though, to your point.
Exactly, 100%. And I can think of some data sources that some of our customers have used in the past to help enrich a personalization experience. For example, I mentioned weather earlier, but you can leverage weather data to drive a much more personalized experience. But again, it's segment based, not individual based. So what we're doing is saying, based on your location and based on everything we know about you, and based on the persona that you fit, we're going to provide a certain amount of relevancy and recommendations to hopefully help you find the most relevant product and help you complete that transaction as quickly as possible.
Awesome.
And then we get to, sorry, Dan, did you have a question?
Nope. I just,
okay.
I know we're
so then,
top of the pyramid here.
At the top of the pyramid, exactly. And this is what I call individualization, okay? And in my experience, I don't think this can be done without having some sophisticated, machine learning-based platform. I use the term AI, carefully because it means so many different things. I prefer to call it, self-tuning, machine learning-based algorithms that can help you drive personalization at an individual basis, right? And that is really the hardest thing to do, especially across all of your channels, so that it's consistent across all of your channels. But individualization is about understanding the historical patterns of that individual and then starting to use sometimes predictive analytics to say, based on what we know and based on all of the data points we have and based on all of the personalization infrastructure work that we've done to date, we can now not only provide the most relevant information based on historical data, but we can start to predict what this user or consumer may be looking for next, right? And being able to do that using manual rules is impossible.
So give me an example. Certainly I understand this from a B2C standpoint, but give us some examples of how B2B can be using this individualization.
It's an interesting question you ask because I think individualization is even more relevant in B2B than it is, and more powerful in B2B than it is in B2C. Primarily, so there's a lot of things circling in my head when you ask that question. When I look at B2C, one of the most underused things I find is the search box itself, because a consumer is telling you what their intent is, and most companies don't use that information to drive individualization. But in a B2B organization, you already know their intent because everybody is authenticated. Generally speaking, people authenticate in order to transact in a B2B environment. And you've got an incredibly rich amount of data, whether it has to do with purchase history of people who are like the person who's logging in, the browsing history, the what's happening within that geography, and then leveraging that information to try to predict what that consumer wants to do. And the reason I say that it's more important in B2B than anywhere else is it really goes back to understanding the intent of the customer, right? We know that in B2B, the buyer's intention is to complete a transaction. There's a lot of literature written around, what drives loyalty in B2B. And what drives loyalty in B2B, by far, is ease of transaction. So if you're able to predict what the next order is going to contain or what this person is going to be looking for and really provide an individualized set of recommendations, you're simplifying the transaction and you're driving loyalty. And that's more important in B2B, in my opinion, than it is in B2C.
It's funny. My sister is a buyer for a hard drive manufacturer, and we get talking shop sometimes, and she'll be talking about needing to find a screw, and the screw's not available anymore. But that's almost the type of thing, and I'm listening to you speak, and I'm thinking, wow, if you could do sort of a pattern match, be able to say, hey, this person is out, but this one is in, or this company is often behind. I mean, if you have that level of detail of knowing what the supply chain and knowing more and more about your manufacturers, that could be levels of assistance that I think she would love.
100%. And, I think what you're sharing is a sentiment that exists across most of the buyers that we've interviewed. So a lot of times when we're working with our customers, they want us to do ethnographic research amongst their consumers, the end customer, and that's the sentiment that we hear a lot. The other sentiment that we hear a lot, which we haven't talked about before, Diane, is this concept of the importance of self-service. So as the buyers are becoming younger, they want to be able to self-service far more than the previous generations. And so leveraging individualization to allow them to self-service themselves, especially in a B2B context, is exceptionally valuable. And I'll just take it a step further and talk about, again, I know we're talking a little bit more about B2B right now than maybe we planned, but the value of your sales team, whether in B2C or B2B, whether it's staff in a store or whether it's your field sales team, being able to give them the same tools, so leveraging the same technology and giving them the same tools so that they can provide that individualized experience when someone is interacting with them, whether, again, it's a teller at a bank or a field sales team taking an order for food at a restaurant. Can these tools be used to help them provide additional value to the end consumer? And that's an area that I find is ignored a lot of times, but is a great example of what I mean when I talk about consistency of experience across all of your touch points and all of your channels.
All right. So we've raced through the pyramid. Now let's take a step back and start looking at some of the elements. You mentioned the search box. You're a big fan of the search box. In fact, a couple months ago, I heard you on a webinar with my colleague Justin, and you made a point to say that Real Decoy was an expert in digital commerce search. Why do you feel so strongly about emphasizing search?
Yeah, it's funny because I consider myself to be an expert in helping companies improve their conversion rates. But in doing so, we find that the number one driver of improved conversion rates tends to be in the search box, right? So the search box is extremely important when it comes to improving conversion rates. So 30% of website visitors start their website, their visits using the search box. That's an incredible metric. And it's funny because a lot of times I talk to companies and they say, no way, that's not possible. Then they go look at their metrics and they realize that is the case. So let's just talk first about the search box itself, right? And when I talk about search, I talk about more than just the search box. I talk about everything that's driven through a findability experience. Like, how do you find a product? Once someone lands on your website, how do we connect them with the right information or the right product? So the search box is extremely important because the customer is telling you their intent. And if you don't action that information, you're leaving a lot on the table in terms of conversion opportunity. So in the search box, when someone types in black dress, is your search able to determine what word is an attribute and what word is the actual product? And are you able to then provide the most relevant information back? Okay. And if I use B2B actually as an example, in a lot of studies that have been done, 50% of buyers in B2B rank search experience as the most important feature on a B2B website when they want to buy something. Okay, so it's a very important tool. But here's the part that really concerns me. Okay, the data says that of those 30% of website visitors that start their experience through the search box, 80% of those will abandon the site because the search experience is not what they expected at the first click. Okay, so that equates to 24% of all of your website visitors will leave your website because the search experience is not what they expected. I mean, you let that sink in for a little bit, and you think about, the cost of acquisition and how much it costs to drive new eyeballs to your website. So if you spend $1 million on a marketing program to drive people to your website, 24% of them, so $240,000, you're flushing down the toilet because your search experience is not what they expected. That's a tremendous amount of waste.
Yeah, it's funny. I just had a roundtable, an executive roundtable that I was hosting, and the folks at the table, we got talking about search, and they were poo-pooing it. And these are not small brands. These were top 500 brands in the country across cosmetics, beverages, apparel. It was really quite surprising. They said, search. Oh, nobody searches on site anymore. They search through Google. And I was like, literally, what I could do, argue with these people? I'm not going to argue with them, but I was like, trying to ask leading questions. I'm like, yeah, but what if the item that comes up on Google is no longer in your catalog? Can you, suggest something else? And they didn't have an answer for that, but it was just shocking to me that this idea that, site search is horrible. We don't even pay any attention to it.
Just to further validate what you just said, Diane, I recently read a metric. 42% of companies have nobody responsible for website search, their own website search, internal website search. So almost half of companies don't have anyone responsible for that. And it doesn't take a long conversation, to show somebody the data behind why, that's a mistake. It really is a very critical function within the organization. And relying on Google to be the search for your product catalog, I would suggest is a very risky piece of business.
So there's upside if they use search, right? And they like it?
So again, because the search box provides you with understanding of what the customer's intent is, if you do search well, the conversion rates really reflect a huge improvement. So we know, for example, conversion rates can be sometimes twice as high when someone finds a product using the search box, because you know what their intent is, and if you're able to provide the relevant item fast enough, they tend to convert. So again, it's not hard to build out an ROI story around how many people you potentially can lose, or how much you can boost your conversion rate if you do it well. And of course, back to what I said at the beginning, you need to understand if this makes sense for your organization, right? So if you sell 100 different SKUs, chances are the search box isn't as important as if you sold 200,000 variations of a product, right? So it really does depend on each organization, but investing in search can have a significant boost on conversion rates, and that's a fact.
And we're talking about search that has fuzzy logic built into it, type ahead, things like that, things that just make it easier for a person to navigate, right?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for mentioning that, right? So when I talk about search and I say, search is more than just the box itself, the search box is a starting point, and there's a lot of intelligence and function that can take place to help improve the customer experience. So, for example, there's a handful of companies that are doing this really well. But as you're typing in the search box, it's not just about guessing how the sentence is going to complete, auto completing that, but it's about maybe providing merchandising opportunities right out of the search box to say, as you're typing, we're going to start merchandising and recommending products for you or categories for you as you type. Things like natural language processing is extremely important, because when someone types 3 keywords and you search your entire catalog based on just those 3 keywords, the relevancy is not going to be accurate, right? You need to understand what is an attribute as opposed to what is a keyword that you want to be looking for. When you look at the data that you're indexing and you're bringing all of this content together, how can you enrich the content that you have by using various data sources? So search in itself and driving navigation, which I almost forgot about, but driving navigation through the search box and triggering custom landing pages and custom offers through the search box. There's a lot of different things that companies can do to improve the findability of products by leveraging the right search technology.
We mapped this chart here to the pyramid. Once you get past basic search and in your personalization journey, and you start incrementing your way up, we start things with like this content index, this idea that we're taking in more and more types of data and indexing it to make it findable, to make it more relevant. This is part of your segment, your persona-based segmentation. If I know that you're interested in, I ran a contemporary furniture magazine, so green chairs, for example. You keep saying what's the entity and what's the modifier. Green chairs, is that sustainable furniture or is that the color green? So, that ability to sort of get a sense of where we are. But in the meantime, you need to be able to put all of that sustainable information together, and that's part of our content index. When you get to the next phase of your personalization, and this was a question that just came in, and the person asked, can you please explain the difference between personalization and individualization? And maybe with these colored boxes, you can help disambiguate the two.
Yeah, again, the way that I explain it, and I know that in the industry, some companies, I think LucidWorks is one that will say instead of individualization, they say hyper-personalization. The reason I like to use the word individualization is because the personalization is happening at an individual basis instead of based on segment or based on geographic location, based on so really, if you're doing individualization properly, very few people will end up having the same experience on your website as each other. Most people will have an individual experience on your website or on your digital channel or in-store channel. So whatever it is that they're doing, right? Each experience is going to be individual to that customer. With personalization, it's more, it's a little more generic in that you're going to have groups of people that have the same experience.
Okay. So one of the things that you also mentioned earlier is that the millennials, they love self-service. So this idea of natural language search, this ability to be able to understand what a person is looking for, being able to do automatic synonym detection, and that's a whole process in machine learning that uses query analysis. They look at what are people typing, what are they retyping, when they search on one type of product, is it, and you call it, I'm trying to think of now I got to think of some synonyms and I can't, a grill and a barbecue. And when you see clustering of people searching the same thing, suddenly you can automatically derive that these are synonyms. So this type of information of using clustering, using machine learning, using natural language processing, it helps when you're trying to deliver that experience. That a person comes to your site and says, we have an example of is my spouse covered under my car insurance? And we need to know that spouse equals husband, wife, partner, whatever we're calling people, it's significant other. We want to be able to find it, and we want to be able to make sure that we get them the information, because God knows the worst thing that can happen is that dreaded null comes back, nothing found. Nothing's more frustrating.
Yeah, no, and you bring up something very important, and being able to build those. A lot of companies will build those manually, the synonyms, but it's extremely difficult to do that and to scale that in a manual basis. So having the ability for the platform to learn these things is extremely valuable. And from the research that we've done, we find that natural language is less important when people are typing. People have been trained, I guess, by Google and by Amazon to search for things using a set of keywords. But what we're finding is now that people can search using voice, natural language is extremely important because they don't speak the way that they type. So it's very important to have that. But the other thing that you sort of touched on, Diane, and I'm not sure if I'm stealing your thunder a little bit, but the other thing that you're raising here is one of the questions that I often get asked, which is, well, the biggest problem my organization has is the underlying data has problems. I have dirty data. I have too many synonyms in my data. My God, like in B2B, I see that more than anything else. I have too many acronyms in my data. How can I improve the customer experience? How can I drive personalization if the underlying content or the underlying data has issues? And really, all of the things that you just talked about, Diane, are exactly the types of things that can hide the fact that your data is not as clean as it needs to be or is not normalized. Because changing data and improving data, especially when the catalogs are huge, is a massive undertaking. But with the right technology, you can hide most of the problems that exist within your data to the end user. So
one of the areas that I'd like to take a moment here to talk about is it falls into this gold area, which is the tip of the pyramid, user signals. And what we mean, what we at LucidWorks mean by user signals. Sometimes you'd call it behavioral data. Oftentimes you're subscribing. It's a little hard to read, but you're looking at the past queries, purchase history, all of that type of stuff. That But when we talk about it, we're also talking about capturing it as the person is clicking. So what they click on, what they don't click on. Let's say they search for something and it's the 27th item on the list. We now know that for that person, that is what is most relevant to them. And that's what we're starting to log. We look at what goes in the cart, what gets abandoned, what gets bought. So all of those things help the machine become more fine-tuned to what is really important to the person. And I think that this level of looking at signals is really a huge differentiator. I talk to a lot of companies, and a lot of companies are using user behavior data, but they're using it offline to help them figure out what to buy, but they're not using it to help them merchandise. Is that something you're finding too, Richard?
100%. We see that a lot. And the other item that you probably want to mention is this whole concept of sentiment, right? Like understanding behavior helps you understand sentiment too, and being able to leverage that to provide a more relevant result is extremely powerful. And it really is a shame when companies don't use that information because they have access to most of it, right? So to be able to use that information to drive improved conversion.
So real quickly, because I don't want to, we've got a great conversation going, but I do want to take a moment to talk about the Fusion platform. The Fusion server is a NoSQL server. It's built on Solar. The founders of Fusion actually developed Solar. So it's a very secure, stable environment. Fusion makes it even more so. We then married it with AI, machine learning, And what's interesting about machine learning is, and because everything's fortified with AI these days, right? Everybody says, oh, we do AI. And there's so many different flavors. But most of the SaaS models that are out there, most of these fortifications that are provided by the vendor's actually controlling the machine learning. You're not. So if you've invested in data scientists, you're going to want to be able to tweak the algorithms. We ship with them, but you can use your own. You can tweak ours. You have control. And it's funny. It's an area that I've been thinking about a lot. That this is an intellectual property. When you figure out the secret sauce of how to figure out what a person's intent is, why would you want to be developing it for a vendor? Why wouldn't you want to be maintaining that intellectual property, that know-how, your heuristics, if you will? So that's one of the things Fusion AI, Fusion Server combine, and then Fusion App Studio is the ability to build web-based applications quickly. But all of it brings this information together. But you may have a platform, and you don't want all of the Fusion platform, and you work with customers that do that as well, and continue to work with Fusion as well, right? Richard, can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, one of the things, and again, we're not trying to do a sales pitch here, but one of the questions that I get a lot of times, or let's not say questions, one of the concerns I hear a lot is re-platforming, or my e-commerce platform doesn't support these things. I'm not capturing the right information, or the data I have isn't reliable, or I have problems in my data. And re-platforming, my organization just doesn't have the appetite to re-platform our entire e-commerce platform. And the answer really is that is the last thing you want to do, right? I am not a big fan of complete re-platforming. I'm a big fan of incremental and small improvements. And what I like are platforms that can sit on top of. So, for example, when we talk about the Fusion platform, it can sit on top of any existing e-commerce platform, whether it's homegrown, whether it's one of the big, known platforms that's out there, and provide an enriched experience, an intelligent experience for the end customer without having to change any of your underlying systems or any of your underlying processes to manage your e-commerce platform, right? So I think the future is about not big rip and replaces, but is about leveraging technologies that can help you enrich something that you already have for the end customer. And the ROI is a lot easier to measure that way.
Certainly. The other thing I'd like to mention too is that we talk about the outcomes. When you can get people to stay on your site, and obviously it's important to B2B, but this is crucial to B2C. You go to that search window, you search, you don't find what you want, but you have a suggestion there that's now in the ballpark of what the person was looking for, or a really, really, really close match. Chances are they're going to add to cart. And these are great for you as well. You've got all the stats on the back of your hand, so why don't you go through what you've seen?
Yeah, and all of these things tie together, right? And that's why when I talk about search experience being more than just that little box where you type something in, search experience can drive every interaction that a customer has with your brand, right? And the data is overwhelming when it comes to the value that provides in terms of both increasing conversion rates, as in like how many people actually complete a purchase, but it also in terms of improving the average order value. So again, I'll touch on B2B just quickly because I recently was working with a company, a big B2B company, around average order value. Just by leveraging some what I would consider to be basic predictive analytics, we were able to increase average order value by 60%. And that's just because we're trying to predict what this buyer may have forgotten or may not be aware exists by the vendor, right? So So that's an area. I mean, just imagine if you can increase your average order value by that sort of number. And then, when it comes to click-through rates, again, I consider that to be another conversion measurement. But it's all about, can you provide the most relevant information as quickly as possible to increase your conversion rates, however your company measures conversion.
So I want to just go through these last couple of slides about Fusion, just so that when you're perusing it later, we're going to be sending out the recording, and you'll get these slides. You'll have these. So I'm not going to go through each of these pieces, but you've got the search functionality. You've got the machine learning that now makes the browsing that much more enjoyable. And then you have the curation. And I think this is an important thing to mention is that, so many merchandisers have gone to school. They're the tastemakers. They don't want a machine coming out and saying, this is what you must do in every case. They want the ability to override. And so this idea that you should be able to boost and override the machine. And that's really for the merchandiser to determine. So we take them off the grunt work of having to go through all the log files and find all the synonyms. The machine can do that. We let them come back and be the tastemaker and provide that level of expertise that I think will help set your company apart from someone else's. So I want to zip to our last couple of slides here. The questions are sort of overwhelming, and I've been hanging on to answering some of them as they come in, but we've got a lot. I did see this. This is a LucidWorks customer. I wanted to give you, Richard went through those metrics. They saw a 50% increase in transactional revenue since the migration, and that's Lenovo. So again, I think, if you're out there having to put together a business case, these types of pieces of information we're providing you are going to be really, really helpful. So you want to give shoppers what they want, and that means you get higher conversions, increased AOV, greater customer loyalty. Let's go through the questions really quickly, and if we don't get to them, we will answer them and send them to you offline. But how can we personalize if a customer is not searching? It's an interesting question. I'm not really sure I am.
Yeah, that's a great question actually, because while I talk a lot about the importance of the search box because the customer is sharing what their intent is, a lot of we said 30% of visits start in the search box, but 70% of them don't start in the search box. So the answer is there's a lot of different data points that can be used to drive personalization when someone is not using the search box. Depending on things like, do we know who they are? Do we not know who they are? Do we know what geography they're visiting from? Do we know what, through cookies, do we know if they've visited your website before or the types of products that they may have browsed and looked for? If it's a B2B company, if they're authenticated, we know everything about them, right? So there's a lot of different data points that can be used to drive personalization, even if someone doesn't start in the search box. I'd also suggest that the the navigation of your website is also another data point that can help you understand what someone is looking for, right? So if somebody's been clicking a lot on help and contact us, and you can start understanding or predicting the type of experience they're looking for, the types of questions that they might be asking. So again, without knowing the exact industry, it's hard to provide more specifics. But that is, there are ways that you can drive some levels of personalization without using the search box.
Sounds good. The next question is, can you give an example for system-generated data?
System-generated
data. So that would be your log files and things like that, wouldn't it? Your queries.
Yes. So I mean that's one aspect of system-generated data, right? So data that you don't currently necessarily have So, for example, when you look at a product catalog, that's generated by your merchandisers or your product people. Your system will generate. You've got systems that generate data around customer browsing, customer interaction on the website, user behavior through different interactions. All of those data points can be leveraged to drive personalization without going through a manual process. And so one of the things that I like about, let's call it more sophisticated search platforms, is that you can ingest data more than just what data your organization currently has, right? So you can ingest both structured and unstructured data. You can ingest data that exists within your organization. But you can also subscribe to data that exists elsewhere, right? And buy data and scrape data from other places. The key here being that it doesn't matter what the source of data is. What matters is what is the use case for the type of data that you need to gather in order to drive the personalization experience. And once you have that figured out, we can work backwards to make sure that we can build a plan in order to help you get access to the data that you need.
So the next question is a little bit lengthy, but can you please explain what are the information that's collected for individualization apart from customers' personal info, purchase history, and discovery behavior, and how much of customers' data is persisted, and how machine learning and AI will work in this case?
Oh, wow. I think if I may suggest, I think we should write a blog. I think we should write a blog post to cover that. That's a big question. We've only got 2 minutes, but that's a great question, right? Is what sort of data points can we use in order to drive real individualization? So all of the examples that were provided in the question are 100% accurate. But in addition to that, there's sentiment-based data that we can use, and then there's using the information about like people, right? So someone that fits potentially your type of persona and being able to predict your behavior off of what they've been doing, if that makes sense, right? So again, I think that's a question that we should. I think that deserves its own webinar or its own blog post. It's just to get deeper into what individualization means. Yeah.
All right, and then is there any magic that helps us figure out unregistered customers when they're coming in from 2 or 3 different devices? Is there any way to figure out that it's all the same person, or is that just like, we can't do that yet?
No, there are techniques that can be used to help. I mean, it's not going to be 100% of the time, but there are techniques that can be used to help you to start identifying users who are visiting from various channels, right? So through IP addresses and through different things, there's different ways and different technologies that can be used to help you, at least within a certain amount of accuracy, tell if someone is visiting, if it's the same user that's just visiting from different channels.
Okay. And do you have to, I'm going to make this the last question for now, but like I said, if we haven't gotten to your question, we can answer these behind the scenes. So do I have to proceed up the pyramid sequentially, or can I work on multiple levels of the pyramid at once?
Great question. So you can absolutely work on different parts of the pyramid or bits and pieces. What we put together is not sort of like the gold standard of this is how you must proceed up the pyramid. It's just what we tried to put together is sort of the general approach that most companies take, or the general flow that most companies take. But you can absolutely work on different aspects of the pyramid in parallel. But I've rarely seen companies be able to do individualization without having done all of the other things first.
We are out of time, but I want to get another plug in here. We are hosting our annual Activate conference. It's in September. Would love to have you guys all there. It's September 9th through 12th in Washington, D.C. If you register before the 6th, you'll save $200. There's the link to the website. We have a special digital commerce track. We'll be going through a lot of things. I've got a best practices in digital commerce presentation I'll be doing, been running a survey over the last 2-3 weeks. Maybe some of you have actually participated. If you haven't and you want to add your name, we'll make sure you get the link to that survey. It closes this week, but activate September 9th through 12th. Richard, will you do another webinar with me? And this one we'll do on B2B?
I'd love to. I love the topic of B2B, and I'd love to do another webinar on B2B.
All right, awesome. Then stay tuned for that one as well. You will get this recording probably tomorrow. We will let you know when we're going to be following up with the B2B webinar. And I want to thank Richard Isaac for being here today. You've been really a great sport. And thank all of you for listening. And if you have any more questions, just throw them in there and we'll get to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much.